If you stopped showing up to these family dinners, no one would even notice, Drew said with a chuckle, stabbing a piece of roast chicken with his fork. Laughter broke out across the table. His girlfriend, Cammy, snorted wine through her nose. My sister-in-law, Noelle, rolled her eyes dramatically and laughed as if Drew had just delivered the punchline of the year. Even my husband, Calder, gave a lazy smirk without looking up from his phone. Everyone laughed. Everyone but me. I forced a smile, the kind you give when you're trying not to ruin a party, and reached for my water glass with steady hands. We were sitting on the screened-in porch of Calder's childhood home in Charleston, South Carolina. It was one of those sticky summer nights when the humidity coats your skin like syrup, and the cicadas scream from every tree. His family gathered here every Sunday without fail. Home-cooked food, wine, inside jokes I never quite understood. I'd been part of it for 7 years and still felt like a guest. A tolerated outsider. "Come on, Isla," Noelle said with a grin. "You know Drew's just teasing. Don't be so sensitive." I gave her that same neutral smile. The one that meant I won't cause a scene even though I have every right to. Calder didn't look up. Just kept scrolling. I let the moment pass. I'd become skilled at that. But something shifted in me that night. Something I couldn't ignore. For the first time, Drew's offhand cruelty didn't just sting. It rang with clarity. He wasn't joking. Not really. They didn't see me. I was a ghost in my own life. And worse, I'd let it happen. I met Calder in the off-season, the part of the year when Charleston feels like it's catching its breath. Late January. The tourists were gone, the palm fronds sagged with frost, and the city seemed hushed, like a cathedral between hymns. I was freelancing from a studio apartment above a candle shop on Queen Street, designing user interfaces for a boutique tech firm out of Portland. Long days, late nights, little sleep, but I was building something. Quietly, steadily. Calder walked into my life wearing a faded blazer and that effortless kind of charm that Southern men seem born with. He'd just left his job in marketing to start a nonprofit focused on marine conservation. He talked about big ideas, legacy, impact. He made people lean in when he spoke. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Our first date lasted 4 hours. He asked about my work, and when I explained that I built UX systems for software companies, he said, "That's adorable. You must be crazy smart to figure out all those techie things." I remember laughing, brushing it off as flirtation. I didn't realize then how often I would hear that word. Adorable. My job. My ideas. My ambitions. Adorable. By the time we got engaged a year later, Calder's family already had me in a box. I was the artsy one. The girl who wore glasses and brought kale chips to cookouts. The woman with a little design job, who worked from one of those co-working places with bean bags. At first it didn't bother me. I thought it was just surface-level misunderstanding. Something that time and proximity would soften. I figured they'd ask questions eventually. That one Sunday dinner, Calder's mom Lorraine would look across the table and ask, "So Isla, what exactly do you do?" And I'd explain. I'd tell them that I'd founded a UX consultancy 3 years ago. That I had 4 full-time contractors. That my client list included names they'd actually recognize. Spotify, MailChimp, even the Charleston Tourism Board, ironically. But that moment never came. Instead, Noelle would hand me her phone and ask me to help her recover her Instagram password. Kemi would ask if I could make her a logo real quick for her dog treat Etsy store. Calder would refer to my income as bonus money. Me. I'd smile. I'd laugh. I'd stay polite. I kept my invoices, tax returns, and profit margins to myself. Partly because I didn't want to seem like I was bragging. Mostly because I'd been trained, slowly, silently, to believe that keeping the peace mattered more than being seen. The house we lived in now, a 2-story Craftsman with a wraparound porch and gas lanterns, had been purchased with a down payment that came entirely from my savings. Calder's nonprofit hadn't turned a profit in years. Most of its funding came from grants I'd helped him apply for, or quietly donated to under a second LLC I set up just for that purpose. I never asked him to tell his family the truth. I assumed one day he just would. But he never did. And in the absence of truth, a narrative grew like ivy. That Calder was the passionate idealist trying to save the oceans, and I was the quiet, supportive wife who did something techie from home. That was who they thought I was. But the truth? The truth was that I paid for the house. I paid for the private health insurance when Calder got dropped from his previous plan. I paid for the grant writer who got him into his last round of funding. I paid the damn internet bill that kept their adorable little techie wife in business. And still to them I was a name tag at a reunion. A +1. A chair to fill. The Monday after that dinner I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I opened my accounting dashboard. Not because I needed to, everything was automated, running smoothly, humming like a well-oiled engine. But because I needed to see it. I needed to remind myself that I existed beyond casserole dishes and polite laughter. The numbers blinked back at me from my monitor like quiet proof. Q2 revenue, $136,000. Pending invoices, $41,200. Cash on hand, $312,000. Net margin, 74%. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't beginner's luck or a windfall. This was built, line by line of code, contract by contract, pitch deck by pitch deck. I hadn't inherited anything. I hadn't married into money. I'd made this life with nothing but my laptop and a stubborn refusal to quit. And yet, not one person at that dinner table knew any of it. Calder certainly didn't. He'd never once asked what my monthly revenue looked like. He had a vague sense that I was doing well, in the same way someone assumes their neighbor's garden is flourishing because the fence looks green. I tried once. 2 years ago, during a quiet moment in bed, I told him I'd closed a contract with a mid-sized tech incubator in Raleigh. I'd flown there, met with their CTO, pitched a total redesign of their user platform. The deal was worth $80,000. He blinked, then said, "Wow, that's more than my whole annual salary in year 1. And then he rolled over and went to sleep. Not, "That's incredible." Not, "Tell me more." Not even, "How'd you do it?" Just sleep. And I didn't bring it up again. Because I learned, that night and so many others, that it was easier to dim myself than to watch the people I love blink uncomfortably in the light. That's the thing no one tells you about being a quietly successful woman. It's not that people resent you. It's that they're so used to not noticing you that your success feels like a trick. Like you slipped it past them unfairly. In Calder's family I was convenient. I wasn't loud. I didn't take up space. I baked things from scratch and didn't ask questions when plans were made without me. I was what you'd call a low-maintenance wife. That's what Drew had once said to Calder right in front of me, like I wasn't sitting there. "You lucked out with Isla, man. She's so low maintenance." And Calder had laughed. "I know, right? She'll never nags me about money or anything." I remember excusing myself to the kitchen and standing at the sink, staring into a mug I hadn't even filled. My nails dug crescents into the ceramic rim. That same week I'd paid off Calder's student loans in full, $46,000, which I'd pulled from an emergency reserve account. He never told his family. Never even said thank you. But then again, how can someone thank a ghost? That morning, sitting at my desk in the office I designed myself, with the art I chose, the lighting I loved, I opened a spreadsheet I hadn't touched since last tax season. It listed every dollar that had come in through my business, and every dollar that had gone out to support Calder, his nonprofit, and his family. The totals startled even me. In 5 years I'd contributed over $780,000 to our life. Our house. My down payment. Our vacations. Mostly charged to my business card. The grant writer for Calder's foundation? Paid in full by me. The new roof on his parents' house last summer? Disguised as a foundation grant, routed through my second LLC. And somehow I was still the quiet one who does computer stuff. Invisible labor. Invisible success. Invisible me. I clicked the spreadsheet closed and sat in silence. My eyes drifted across the room, past the window where Spanish moss hung like old secrets from the oaks. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not sadness, not even anger. Resolve. This wasn't about proving them wrong. This was about finally seeing myself clearly. No fog, no filter, no more waiting for someone else to name my worth. I wasn't going to ask to be seen anymore. I was going to start living like I already was. It started with small things. The next Sunday I didn't bake anything for dinner. No rosemary bread. No key lime pie. I brought a store-bought salad in a plastic container and didn't apologize for it. Lorraine looked at it like I'd placed a bucket of drywall on the counter. "Oh," she said, barely masking the disappointment. "That's simple." I smiled. "Isn't it?" At dinner, I didn't ask Noelle about her latest real estate listing. I didn't offer to help Cammie with her Canva presentation. I didn't even correct Drew when he referred to me as a tech support person. I just sat, smiled, and let them talk. Calder noticed. He shot me a few sideways glances but said nothing until we got in the car. "You good?" he asked, pulling out of the gravel driveway. "Great," I said, watching the darkened marshlands stretch past the window. "You were quiet." "Just listening." He nodded and we drove the rest of the way in silence. I'd spent years filling in the emotional blanks of our life. Softening moments, managing tension, doing the invisible work of relationship maintenance. But now I'd stopped. And when I stopped, I saw it. How empty it all actually was without my constant patching and smoothing. Without me anticipating everyone's needs, the Bennetts were awkward. They repeated the same 3 anecdotes over dinner. They forgot to ask about each other's lives. There was no real curiosity in the room, just habit and wine. And Calder, without my affirmations, my interest, my emotional energy, seemed flat. Like a man half-painted. That week I ran a small test. I didn't remind him to follow up with his grant coordinator. I didn't organize the donor spreadsheet he'd forgotten about on his desktop. I didn't forward him the email from his board chair asking for a budget update. By Friday he was panicking. "Babe," he called from the dining room, "did you ever see that email from Carla about the budget thing?" I did. Silence. "Did you reply?" "Nope." More silence. He appeared in the doorway of my office, half-dressed in a wrinkled button-down. "Everything okay?" I looked up from my monitor. "Perfect." He stared at me like I was a stranger. And maybe in that moment I was. Or maybe he was the stranger, someone I'd built a life with but never really built into. I thought about telling him then. About the money. About the house. About how much I'd carried without recognition. But I didn't. Not yet. I wanted to see how long he'd notice the cracks now that I wasn't spackling over them. That weekend I drove out to Edisto Beach alone. I told Calder I had a client off-site, but really I just needed air. Salt and wind and silence. I brought a notebook. Not the one I use for client notes or wireframes or content strategy. A blank one. And on the first page I wrote, "What would my life look like if I stopped performing?" Then I let the question sit. 4 hours. That night, I sat on the porch of a rented cottage overlooking the ocean, sipping bourbon from a chipped mug, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like driftwood and laundry soap. The moon was low and fat on the horizon. The surf rolled in slow like a creature that never tires. And I realized something. If I left tomorrow, Calder would survive. But he wouldn't understand what he lost. Because he never saw it to begin with. The real me. The builder. The strategist. The quiet architect of a life that looked beautiful on the outside, but was hollow underneath. I'd made it all easy for him. Too easy. Now I wanted to see what would happen when I stopped making things easy. The morning I decided to leave Calder wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting match, no betrayal uncovered, no final straw snapped in two. There was just a quiet. I sat on the back steps of our house, still in my robe, with a mug of black coffee cooling between my palms. The air smelled like dew and magnolia, and the early sun was just beginning to rise behind the trees. Calder had already left. Early meeting, something about a potential donor from Savannah. I hadn't asked for details. He hadn't offered them. I stared at the garden beds I'd installed last fall, beds he took credit for when his family came over. Isla's little hobby, he'd called them once, just before Lorraine complimented the camellias. He hadn't lifted a finger. That was the thing about Calder. He didn't lie with malice. He lied with silence. He let people believe what was convenient. And I had been convenient. Perfectly so. I padded back inside and opened my laptop. There it was again, high truth in numbers. 12 current clients. 3 retainers expiring soon. 1 corporate contract in Seattle asking to extend with a 40% rate increase. And then the line that sat in the pit of my stomach like a stone. Annual YTD revenue. $398,200. It was early August. And I'd done all of it while pretending I was just a freelance designer with too much time and a good sourdough recipe. I opened our joint checking account next. $11,200 balance. Calder had deposited $1,100 from his last grant cycle. I'd deposited $9,400 from a UX overhaul I did in 3 weeks. The math was so clear it hurt. So why was I still here? That question pulsed through my veins as I opened a new browser tab and typed Charleston to Seattle moving companies. Not to click. Not yet. But to see. And there it was. $4,800 for a small home relocation 2-bedroom. Timeline, 10 to 14 days. I could afford it 50 times over. And still I hesitated. Not because I loved Calder. I loved who he pretended to be. That early version of him who read Wendell Berry aloud to me on the floor of my apartment, who bought a second-hand kayak so we could paddle through the marshes on Sundays. But that man was a marketing campaign. The real Calder hadn't asked me a question about my work in 6 months. I tested that too. A week prior, I landed a massive project. Redesigning the entire interface for a California-based medtech company entering the European market. $110,000 contract. Tight turnaround. Heavy architecture work. I celebrated by picking up Thai food, setting the table with real napkins and lighting a candle. He walked in, kissed the top of my head, said, smells amazing, and poured himself a beer. I told him about the project. Mentioned the scope. The number. He paused. Just for a beat. Then said, think we can finally upgrade the deck furniture? Not, congratulations. Not, that's incredible. Not even, tell me more. Just the deck furniture. The lie we lived in wasn't just that he was the provider. It was that I didn't mind being invisible, that I preferred it. But I didn't. And now, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would happen if I stepped out of the shadow. That week I began preparing. I didn't pack a bag. I packed systems. I opened a new business bank account in Washington state. I filed paperwork to transfer my LLC to operate across state lines. I signed a lease on a studio apartment in Seattle's Fremont district, walking distance to 2 major clients and half a block from a cafe that roasted their own beans. I paid everything in full. No credit cards. No loans. Just money I'd earned while everyone looked the other way. I even reached out to a boutique branding agency to help me rebrand my firm under a new name. I wanted nothing that tied me back to the old version of me. No breadcrumbs. When I finished, I looked around my office. The prints on the walls. The whiteboard covered in client notes. The post-it with Calder's dentist appointment. The only non-work thing in the entire room. This wasn't his space. It never had been. This was mine. And now I was taking it with me. I didn't plan to tell him that night. But truth, like water, finds its cracks. It was a Tuesday, warm, heavy with that coastal stickiness that made every cotton shirt feel damp. Calder came home late, blazer slung over one shoulder, phone pressed to his ear. I was sitting at the kitchen table, closing out a product design sprint for a fintech client in Vancouver. He kissed the top of my head without looking. Sorry, he mouthed. Long day. I nodded and kept typing. He ended the call, grabbed a beer from the fridge and leaned against the counter. Carla thinks the donor from Savannah is close to committing. If he signs, that's 6 months of operations covered. I looked up. That's good. He smiled. We'll be able to breathe a little. We'd be able to breathe. I turned my laptop slowly and showed him the invoice I'd just sent. Final phase delivery, $57,000. Due net 10. Client. Tangletree Financial, Vancouver, British Columbia. Calder blinked. Is that real? Yes. He stepped closer. Wait, is that for the thing you were working on last month? No. That was a different contract. This is a new one. He stared at the screen as if it might shift into a more comprehensible shape. 57,000, he repeated. For one project? I closed the laptop gently. For the last phase of one project. Silence. Then, almost sheepishly, how much do you make in a year? I looked at him. Really looked. His eyes weren't defensive. They were uncertain. Unequipped. Last year just under $410,000. This year I'll pass that by October. He let out a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a laugh. You're joking. I shook my head. You've been living with a version of me that doesn't exist. And I've been letting you. He lowered himself into the chair across from me, the beer still in his hand, unopened. I didn't know. I know. Why didn't you say anything? I laughed, not bitter but tired. I did. You didn't listen. He bristled slightly. That's not fair. No, what's not fair is that your mother thinks I play on Pinterest all day while I fund your nonprofit, paid off your debt, and covered every vacation your family has taken in the past 3 years. His jaw tightened. You never told me you felt this way. No, I said quietly. I told you the truth. You just didn't like how it sounded, so you turned it into a hobby story. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, You make more than me. Yes. And you always have? Since our second year together. He ran a hand through his hair. Jesus. I waited. For defensiveness. For guilt. For understanding. For anything real. Instead he said, So what? You want me to make some announcement? Tell my whole family that you're the one holding everything together. I tilted my head. Do you hear yourself? He looked away. I stood and poured his beer down the sink quietly. Then I said, I'm leaving in 2 weeks. He whipped around. What? I've accepted a lease in Seattle. Re-registered my business. Movers are scheduled. I've already transferred my assets. I've even hired a lawyer to draft the separation paperwork. You're kidding. I'm not. He took a step toward me. Isla, don't do this. I held his gaze. You already did. That night he slept on the couch, or at least he pretended to. I heard him pacing around 2 a.m., his footsteps heavy, looping from kitchen to hallway and back. He didn't knock on my door. He didn't try to talk again. And in that silence I realized something simple and devastating. He missed the version of me he could ignore. He didn't want the whole of me, only the part that kept things smooth. The week that followed was the quietest of our marriage. No fights. No pleas. Just absence. Calder moved through the house like a man trying not to wake a sleeping dog. He made his own coffee. Ate cereal for dinner. Stopped asking where I was going. He didn't try to convince me to stay, not really. He just floated, stunned and vague, as if he believed this might all reverse itself if he simply behaved well enough. But I wasn't leaving out of anger. And you can't negotiate your way out of someone's awakening. I spent that week orchestrating my disappearance with surgical precision. I moved first. I finalized the business registration in Washington state. I transferred client contracts to my new address. I rerouted all payments through my new bank account. I canceled our joint credit card. Left his untouched. Mine went with me. I left our shared home office exactly as it was. But took my hard drives, my journals, the notebooks with wireframes and brand strategy notes. The mind of the business left with me. He could keep the shell. I moved second. I notified clients of the relocation. Carefully worded emails, no drama, just logistics. As of September 1st, my business operations will be transitioning to Seattle. Nothing changes on your end, except improved access to Pacific time zones and an exciting growth phase. I signed 2 new clients that week alone. One was a startup in Redmond that had been following my work for months. They scheduled a discovery call the day after I arrived. Seattle wasn't just my exit. It was my evolution. I moved third. I called Calder's mother. Not because I owed her anything, but because I wanted clarity. Lorraine, I said, I won't be at Sunday dinner. Oh. She sounded distracted. Out of town. Yes. Permanently. Silence. I've accepted a position in Seattle. I'm relocating my business. Longer silence. I see. She cleared her throat. And Calder? I let that question hang. Then said, You once called my business a little side thing. I thought you should know it's what kept your son's nonprofit alive the past 4 years. Her voice faltered. Isla, that's not true. Actually, it is. And I only regret letting that lie live for so long. I hung up before she could recover her composure. The morning I left, the movers arrived at 6:45 a.m. sharp. They were fast, professional, quiet. Everything fit into the truck with eerie ease, like the house was already letting go of me. I left a letter on the kitchen table. Not to twist the knife, just to document the reality Calder had chosen not to see. Calder, you once said I was the glue that held things together. But glue cracks under pressure. I supported your dreams, your work, your story, while slowly erasing myself from my own. This house, this life, this marriage, all of it looked good on paper, but it was never built to withstand honesty. I don't want to be invisible anymore. I don't want to be convenient. I want to be real. You may not understand this now. That's okay. But one day when the quiet finally sets in, I hope you remember. It wasn't rage that made me leave. It was clarity. Isla. I closed the door behind me without looking back. The sun was just beginning to rise over Charleston. The air smelled like salt and beginning. And as the truck pulled away from the curb, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Weightless. Seattle greeted me with rain. Not the dramatic crashing kind. The kind that whispers. Constant, soft, soaking, like the city itself was cleansing me as I arrived. My new apartment was small but sunlit, tucked above a plant shop in Fremont. Hardwood floors. A brick wall. A bay window with a built-in bench. I didn't bring much with me, but it didn't feel empty. It felt intentional. For the first time in years, every item in my space had been chosen. Not inherited. Not accommodated. Not explained. The first week passed in a blur of movement and silence. Client meetings. Walks to Green Lake. Quiet mornings with coffee in my laptop. No more side-eye glances. No more passive jokes about my little projects. No one asking for tech support mid-meal. Just work I loved. Space I owned. A life I didn't have to defend. I updated my business website. Posted a case study. Scheduled a webinar. Within 10 days I'd landed 2 more contracts and a speaking invitation at a local UX summit. The difference was staggering. Charleston made me feel like I needed to translate my worth. Seattle just read me fluently. The calls began about 2 weeks later. Noel messaged me on Instagram. Hey, is it true? You moved? What happened? I didn't respond. Lorraine sent an email. Subject, concerned. Calder won't talk. We're worried. Can we talk? I deleted it. But then there was Drew. The same Drew who'd laughed at my supposed irrelevance. The same man who once said no one would notice if I vanished. He left a voicemail. Kiki. Hey, listen, I heard what's been going on. I didn't realize how much you were handling. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel, well, just, if you ever want to talk. I sat with that for a long time. Not because I wanted to reply, but because I realized something important. My absence wasn't silent. It echoed. Back in Charleston, the nonprofit began to slip. Slowly at first. Missed deadlines, dropped sponsors, a budget gap Calder didn't know how to close. The grant writer I'd hired resigned. One of the board members emailed me privately, asking if I'd consider returning in a consulting role. Thanked him. And declined. The ecosystem I'd upheld was dissolving. Because that's what happens when the foundation quietly leaves the building. One night in mid-October I stood by the window of my apartment, watching the rain string across the glass. My laptop sat open on the counter behind me, still aglow with contracts and code. My phone buzzed. A photo. No message. It was Calder, blurry and alone, sitting on the back porch of our old house. My garden, now overgrown, framed him like a ghost from a different timeline. I didn't reply. Not because I hated him, but because I was no longer waiting to be seen. 6 months later I stood backstage at the UX Northwest Summit in Seattle, holding a warm paper cup of coffee and glancing at my notes. The auditorium beyond the curtain buzzed with quiet energy. Designers, founders, engineers, product people. Real ones. Ones who knew what it meant to build things that worked, things that mattered. The organizer, a woman named Ray, touched my elbow. You're up next, she whispered, smiling. Full room. I stepped into the light. No slides. No flashy visuals. Just a mic and a story I had waited years to tell. My name is Isla Mercer, I began, and for a long time I was invisible. Not because I wasn't doing the work, but because I let people believe that what I did didn't matter. The room was still. I ran a 6-figure consultancy from my living room while my husband's family thought I made Pinterest mood boards for fun. I paid our mortgage, his debt, his nonprofit's payroll, and still I was called low maintenance. Soft laughter, nods. But I want to be clear. This story isn't about blame. It's about clarity. It's about what happens when you stop performing someone else's version of you, and finally live your own. I paused. In the past 6 months I've doubled my revenue, expanded my team, and built something I don't have to shrink myself to keep. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was solid. Like something landing in place. Like something earned. After the talk, people approached me one by one. Women in startups. Women in quiet jobs. Women with voices full of recognition. Thank you. I needed to hear that. That was me. I'm still there. I stayed and answered every question. Gave out my email. Connected them to resources. No secrets. No hoarding. Just light passed forward. Because I had made myself visible. And now I was helping others do the same. That night I walked home through light rain, past bookshops and small cafes glowing amber against the chill. My new apartment was warm and quiet, filled with soft textiles and unfinished ideas. A space still becoming. I hung my lanyard on a hook near the door. Poured a glass of red wine. Sat at my desk. And opened a blank page titled, "For the Women Who Are Still Disappearing." There would be no dramatic reunion. No final phone call from Calder. No reckoning dinner with Lorraine. They were living their story. But I was finally living mine. And I didn't need to disappear to be seen anymore. Because now I saw myself, fully, freely, without permission. And that was the real beginning.